The jungle air was a thick, wet wool against my skin as the first volley of lead tore through the emerald canopy above. I did not think about the suffocating heat or the leeches, only the rhythmic, heavy thud of my pulse against my eardrums. Every shadow seemed to grow jagged teeth, snapping at us from the rotting darkness of the iron delta. My rifle felt like a natural extension of my arm, spitting fire into the tangled brush as we scrambled for cover behind a decaying log. There was no time for the luxury of fear, only the cold, hard geometry of survival in a place that desperately wanted us dead. We were four men standing against a phantom army, and the clock was ticking down to a zero that felt like eternity. Within hours, I would be dragging a dying man through the salt-choked surf, his blood mixing with the cold brine of the ocean. My legs would scream with the weight of two broken brothers as I paddled into the vast, uncaring abyss of the open sea. I would look back at the distant shore and see the muzzle flashes of 600 enemies, knowing that only my shoulders stood between them and the grave. The water would become both a sanctuary and a prison, holding us in its wet embrace for 3 agonizing hours of uncertainty. This was the specific moment that would define my existence and haunt my dreams for the next 50 years. We were drifting on the edge of the world, waiting for a miracle that seemed entirely impossible to the rational mind. I was born in the humid, dusty heart of the southern plains, a place where the summer sun baked the red clay into solid bricks. My father was a man of very few words and only 6 years of formal education, but he understood the deep value of a bloodline. He often told us that if something was truly meant to be, it was entirely up to the individual to make it happen. Every uncle I had possessed a starched uniform and a haunting story of service, casting long, noble shadows over my childhood years. I grew up believing that the family was the only fortress worth defending in a world made of shifting sands and broken promises. We were raised on the legend of 5 brothers who perished trying to save one another, a story that became the permanent blueprint for my soul. School was a different kind of battlefield for a boy like me, one where the letters on the page danced and blurred into unrecognizable shapes. The teachers called it a learning disability, but to my young mind it felt like a wall built between my thoughts and the world. I worked twice as hard as the other children just to stay afloat, my father watching my late-night struggles with a quiet, observant pride. I knew that my future would not be found in a ledger, a courtroom, or any place where paper was king. The ocean called to me in my sleep, offering a place where words did not matter, and only strength and instinct held sway. I dreamt of becoming a frogman, one of those elite ghosts who lived in the crashing surf and the deep, silent shadows. At the young age of 17, I signed the official papers that would change the trajectory of my life forever. I entered the service on a special program, eager to prove that a boy who could not read a map could still navigate the darkest waters. My initial assignment was on a heavy destroyer, but the decommissioning of that vessel opened a door I had been waiting to kick down. I volunteered for the most grueling training program the military had to offer, a place where men were broken and then rebuilt from the marrow up. It was the late 1960s, and the entire world seemed to be burning, but I was focused only on the cold Pacific waves. I wanted to see if I was truly the man my father believed me to be during those long nights at the kitchen table. We started with 129 hopefuls, each one convinced of their own physical and mental invincibility. The instructors were architects of misery, specifically designed to find the exact point where a man's will disintegrated into dust. We ran until our boots were filled with blood and swam until our core temperatures plummeted to dangerously low levels. One by one, the others walked to the heavy brass bell and rang it 3 times, signaling their total surrender to the pain. They would quit because their friends quit, proving they were never truly part of the collective whole we were trying to build. By the end of the cycle, only 12 of us remained standing, a brotherhood forged in the literal fires of shared agonizing exhaustion. In that hellish training environment, I learned that the individual is a myth when the lead begins to fly. You do not fight for a silk flag or a distant general. You fight for the man breathing heavily to your left and the one bleeding to your right. Those 12 men became my entire world, a family closer than any I had known in the southern plains of my youth. We understood that if even one of us failed, the entire structure would collapse under the crushing weight of that single failure. I never once looked at that brass bell with anything other than absolute burning contempt. To ring it would be to betray every lesson my father had ever taught me about the absolute sanctity of the pack. My first 3 deployments to the Iron Delta were a blur of midnight insertions and silent ghost-like extractions. We moved like phantoms through the mangrove swamps, our faces painted in shades of dark green and black to match the rotting vegetation. I was not just a soldier, I was a student of the landscape, learning the secret language of the jungle's many shifting sounds. We worked in places that did not exist on any official maps, crossing borders that were supposedly inviolable according to the high commands. The secrecy was a heavy, invisible cloak, but it provided us with the freedom to operate without the constraints of traditional, slow-moving warfare. I returned home after each tour, only to find the call of the shadows growing louder and more insistent in my mind. By the time 1972 arrived, I was a seasoned veteran with a reputation for bringing my men back against all odds. My commander asked me to return for a 4th tour, specifically to lead a group of 6 inexperienced recruits into the breach. These boys had all the training in the world, but they lacked the cynical, sharp edge that only direct combat can provide. I took it as a solemn personal mission to ensure that every single one of them saw their families again. We spent months in the thick of the conflict, navigating the treacherous political and physical terrain of a war that was slowly winding down. I saw the toll it took on their young faces, the way the light in their eyes dimmed with every passing week. The morning of October 31st began with an eerie, heavy stillness that should have served as a final warning. Only Julian Vane and I knew the true classified nature of the mission we were about to undertake that Halloween. We were joined by 2 local commandos, Kalen and Soren, men who had spent their entire lives in the brutal crucible of this conflict. They were not just guides, they were warriors who had survived through sheer grit and a total refusal to accept death. We were heading north, deep into enemy territory where the North Delta Army held absolute, iron-fisted sway. The objective was simple in theory, but practically suicidal in execution. Capture a high-ranking enemy officer for vital, time-sensitive intelligence. We moved 15 miles out to the open sea before cutting hard toward the forbidden coastline of the northern sector. A massive naval vessel, the ironclad Valiant, provided us with the precise coordinates to navigate the treacherous hidden shoals. The navigation was a delicate dance of degrees and minutes, where a single error would land us in the heart of an enemy camp. We slipped into the mouth of the Black Serpent River, the water as dark and viscous as crude oil beneath our hull. The moon was hidden behind a thick, suffocating veil of clouds, granting us the anonymity we required for the silent insertion. We stepped off the boat and into a world of waist-deep mud, tangled vines, and the smell of ancient decay. Our plan was to execute a 5-kilometer horseshoe maneuver, moving inland and then looping back toward the relative safety of the ocean. Every step was a calculated risk, the ground beneath our boots teeming with tripwires and sharpened bamboo stakes hidden in the muck. We moved in absolute silence, communicating through subtle hand signals that had become a natural second language to our team. The humidity was a physical weight, pressing against our lungs and making every single breath feel like a heavy chore. I could feel the presence of the enemy all around us, a cold, persistent prickle on the back of my neck. We were hunters in a land that belonged to the prey, and the roles were about to reverse with violent intensity. We managed to secure one prisoner, a dazed and terrified soldier who had been separated from his main unit in the brush. However, the silence was shattered when a second enemy sentry spotted our position and attempted to flee into the dense tree line. I did not hesitate for a second, pursuing him through the foliage with the single-minded, lethal focus of a predator. 2 rounds from my rifle ended his flight, but the echoes of the shots acted as a beacon for every enemy nearby. Suddenly, the jungle erupted in a terrifying symphony of chaos, explosions, and intersecting lines of tracer fire. We were no longer ghosts. We were targets in a shooting gallery of ancient trees and hidden reinforced bunkers. A grenade tumbled through the humid air, its metallic clinking against the exposed roots sounding like a final death knell for us. It was not like the standard explosives we were used to. It had a long, agonizing fuse that allowed it to be tossed. I watched it roll toward my feet, my heart hammering against my ribs as I realized I had only seconds to react. I grabbed the cold steel and hurled it back, only to see it fly toward me once again like a cursed object. On the fifth exchange, the world vanished in a white-hot flash of searing pain and immense atmospheric pressure. Shrapnel tore into my flesh, biting deep into my legs and torso with the hunger of 1,000 heated needles. I lay on my back for a moment, the sky above spinning in dizzying, sickening circles of blue and gray. Julian was screaming my name from the ridge, his voice a distant echo over the roar of the ongoing, frantic firefight. I could not respond immediately, my throat feeling tight with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid smoke of the blast. 3 enemy soldiers crested the nearby sand dune, their long bayonets gleaming with a lethal, unmistakable intent. Adrenaline, that primal and ancient chemical surge, flooded my system and forced my broken body into sudden, violent motion. I raised my weapon and neutralized the threat before they could even register that I was still breathing and dangerous. Julian and Soren were perched atop a concrete bunker that rose 25 feet above the surrounding barren sand. From their vantage point, they rained disciplined fire down on the advancing waves of the North Delta infantry. I could see the sheer number of them now, at least 75 men closing in from 3 different directions simultaneously. We were pinned against a stagnant lagoon on one side and the vast, uncaring ocean on the other. Julian realized our position was completely untenable and ordered a tactical retreat toward the foaming beach. He promised to cover our movement, staying on the high ground while we scrambled toward the relative safety of the surf. As I fell back toward the shoreline, I looked over my shoulder and saw Julian silhouetted against the hazy afternoon sun. He was launching a rocket at the tree line, a desperate attempt to create a massive diversion for our final escape. Suddenly, his body jerked violently as a high-caliber round found its mark in his left temple with cruel precision. He tumbled down the steep side of the bunker like a discarded rag doll, his weapon clattering uselessly against the stone. Soren scrambled down after him, his face a mask of pure horror as he reached the bottom of the mound. He shouted to me that Julian was gone, his life extinguished by a single cold piece of flying lead. I refused to accept the finality of Soren's words, my father's gravelly voice echoing in my mind about the sanctity of the team. I turned back into the storm of lead, my legs pumping despite the 7 holes that now decorated my weary body. The enemy was closing the distance rapidly, their shouts of triumph growing louder as they saw their prey finally faltering. I reached the base of the bunker and found Julian lying in the red-stained sand, motionless and gray. His eyes were vacant, and it appeared that a significant portion of his skull had been shattered by the impact. I did not care if he was a ghost or a man. I was not leaving him behind. I heaved Julian's limp, heavy body over my shoulder, the weight of him nearly buckling my trembling knees in the sand. Just as I turned to run, a 5-inch shell from the Valiant struck the reinforced top of the bunker. The resulting shock wave was a physical hand that lifted me off the ground and threw me 25 feet. I felt my equilibrium shatter instantly, the world turning into a cacophony of ringing bells and muffled, distant screams. I landed hard on my side, Julian's body sliding away from me into the tall, dry grass of the dunes. For a moment, I forgot who I was or why I was bleeding in the mud of this foreign land. Slowly, the thick fog in my mind began to lift, replaced by the sharp, stinging reality of the present, desperate moment. I crawled toward Julian, my fingers clawing at the earth as I dragged my mangled, unresponsive legs behind me. When I finally reached him, his eyes flickered open for a brief, miraculous second that felt like a gift. He whispered my name, a faint, ragged sound that carried more emotional weight than any massive explosion. That small sign of life was all the fuel I needed to stand up once more against the odds. I hoisted him back onto my shoulders, ignoring the fresh agony that blossomed in my left calf as another bullet hit. We reached the shoreline, a strip of open sand that offered absolutely no protection from the relentless enemy fire. Kalen had already been hit, his right leg a ruin of torn muscle and shattered bone from a previous volley. He was struggling in the deep water, the weight of his gear pulling him beneath the churning gray waves. Soren was further out, his back peppered with jagged fragments from a grenade that had detonated directly behind him. I realized then that I was the only one left with the strength to navigate the final watery obstacle. The ocean was our only hope, a vast graveyard that offered a slim, cold chance of total salvation. I waded into the crashing, salt-heavy surf, the water stinging my open wounds like liquid fire poured onto skin. I managed to secure a life vest around Julian's chest, tying him firmly to my back with a nylon cord. His unconscious head rested against my neck, his shallow, rasping breaths the only rhythm I chose to follow. I looked back and saw Kalen flailing in the foam, his eyes wide with the primal terror of drowning. I swam toward him, hooking my tired arm under his shoulder and pulling him into my orbit. Now I was a human raft, carrying the broken pieces of my team into the deep, dark sea. The sun beat down on us with a vengeful intensity, reflecting off the water until my eyes burned with salt. I paddled with my one free arm, my legs kicking in a rhythmic mechanical motion that I simply refused to stop. Every single muscle in my body was screaming for me to give up and let the current take us. I focused on the horizon, searching for any sign of the extraction boat that was supposed to meet us. The hours began to bleed into one another, marked only by the rising and falling of the heavy tide. I talked to Julian, telling him stories of the southern plains just to keep my own mind from drifting. The water between our bodies grew warm, a small pocket of shared heat that kept Julian from slipping into shock. I could feel his heart beating faintly against my spine, a fragile and persistent drum that kept me moving forward. My own strength was flagging rapidly, my vision narrowing to a small, flickering point of light in the distance. I was losing blood from 7 different locations, my life literally draining into the indifferent blue-green sea. I began to hallucinate, seeing my father standing on the waves with a look of quiet, stern expectation. I told him I was not finished yet, that the mission was not over until every man was home. After 3 hours of battling the elements and the blood loss, a dark shape finally materialized through the haze. It was a local fishing vessel, modified for our operations and manned by a lone, courageous American comrade. They hauled the broken, salt-crusted bodies of my team aboard, their hands rough but gentle as they pulled us. I was the last to leave the water, my fingers cramping so tightly that I had to be pried away. I collapsed onto the wooden deck, the surface feeling like the softest bed I had ever known in my life. We were alive, though the cost of our survival was etched into every single inch of our battered skin. We were eventually transferred to a massive naval hospital ship, a floating sanctuary of white corridors and the smell of antiseptic. Julian was rushed into immediate surgery, a team of neurosurgeons working for 19 hours to repair the damage. I was patched up in a neighboring ward, my body becoming a permanent map of deep scars and surgical stitches. The doctors told me I was lucky to be alive, a sentiment I found very difficult to process. I did not feel lucky. I felt heavy with the weight of everything we had endured in that swamp. I spent my days hobbling down the hall to check on Julian, refusing to leave his side for long. The war continued to rage outside our windows, but for us, the battle had moved into the quiet recovery rooms. Julian would eventually undergo 29 major surgeries over the course of the next 6 years of his life. He lost an eye and a significant portion of his memory, but he never lost his fighting spirit. I was sent back to the States, my time in the shadows finally coming to a long-awaited end. I was told that I had been recommended for the highest honor the nation could possibly bestow. It felt like a strange irony, receiving a medal for a day that had nearly cost me my soul. When the day of the ceremony arrived in Washington, I flatly refused to go to the White House alone. I went to the hospital and essentially kidnapped Julian, wheeling him out of his ward against the staff's protests. I told the high-ranking officials that I did not leave him in the Delta, so I was not leaving. We stood together in the East Room, two broken men in pressed uniforms facing the leader of the country. As the ribbon was placed around my neck, I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of true humility. I was not wearing it for myself, but for the men who never made it back home. In the years that followed, Julian and I remained inseparable, our bond forged in blood, mud, and salt water. I became the godfather to his children, and we spent our summers together in the quiet mountains. We would sit on the porch and argue about trivial things, the ghosts of the Iron Delta finally silenced. He eventually received his own medal, a testament to the bravery he showed before the world went dark. We were like two sides of the same coin, forever linked by a single afternoon in 1972. Our story became a legend, but to us it was simply the fulfillment of a promise made. Now, in the twilight of my life, I look back on those days with a clarity that only time provides. Freedom is a word that many use lightly, but those of us who have bled for it know. It is a debt paid in the currency of youth and sacrifice written in the red ink of veins. I wear my medal as a memorial for the 500,000 who gave everything for this land. America is a grand experiment, a place worth fighting for, despite its many human flaws and historical failures. I am proud to have served, and I would do it all again for the man standing next. My wife often asks me if I still hear the sounds of the jungle in the middle of the night. I tell her that I only hear the steady heartbeat of a brother who refused to stay dead. I see my grandchildren playing in the green grass and know that their peace was bought at a price. The world has changed since 1972, but the nature of courage remains exactly the same today. It is the quiet voice that tells you to get up when your body says to stay down. It is the refusal to leave a friend behind no matter how many bullets are in the air. I am just a man from the southern plains who learned that true strength is found in the collective. My father's lesson remains the cornerstone of my existence. If it is to be, it is up to me. I have traveled to 90 countries and seen the best and worst of humanity in every single corner. Through it all, I have found that love and respect are the only things that truly endure. As long as there are men willing to swim through the dark for one another, there is hope. My watch is nearly over, but I leave the gates of this great nation in very good hands.